felt a strong tug on my shoulder. Opening my eyes, I discerned the silhouette of Lieutenant Zenker in the darkness. He stood over my bunk. "Wake up! You're assigned to the alarm flight," he thundered. "Are you out of your mind? It's still night. I can't even see my own hand." "Don't complain, I can't help it. I'd like to get some more sleep myself. In half an hour, dawn breaks, and we still need to grab something to eat. Hurry up!" Through the window, a white layer of dense fog was visible. Why are they waking us up in such weather? It's dark, foggy, and they're yanking a person out of the best sleep. Reluctantly, I put on my pants and joined the rest of the group. After drinking black, soldierly coffee, we rode in a truck to the runway. The distant sound of warming-up engines could already be heard. Upon arrival, following others, I quickly jumped into the machine. It was warm and cozy inside, perfect conditions to finish the abruptly interrupted dream. "Lieutenant, get out of this rusty junk. I brought breakfast." Sergeant Vrouche woke me up. He had already spread a white napkin under the wing. The sun was warming up stronger, the fog was lifting, and the horizon was slowly clearing. I stretched my sore bones and started eating. "Any news, good sir?" I asked Vrouche. "Not yet. They're trying to catch the morning broadcast in the radio car." I chatted with Chapievsky for a bit, and after breakfast, to gather information, I went to the command post, where the entire squadron was already assembled. Just as I greeted my colleagues, Captain Laskovsky jumped out of the radio car, excited with a gleam in his eyes. We fell silent, looking at the commander questioningly. "Are all pilots present?" he asked escadrille leaders. "Gentlemen, a moment of attention, please," he said slowly and emphatically. "Since 5 in the morning today, we are at war with the Germans. Please remain calm. And as for our duty, I deeply believe that we will fulfill it." We received this news in silence. "Escadrille leaders, please come with me," Captain Laskovsky ordered. Lieutenant Pshimensky, the radio officer, briefed us on the content of the message. Warsaw and almost all our peacetime airbases, civilian airfields, as well as important railway junctions, were already under air attack. Since dawn, fights had started along the entire border. The Germans were advancing in all sectors. The conversation wasn't coming together. Each of us was absorbed in our own thoughts, and the scanty information provided didn't yet offer enough material for discussion. Regardless, we were all excited. This was evident from the visibly nervous puffing of cigarette smoke. Without a word, pilots gathered in groups and headed to their machines. The camouflaged 11s looked like hounds lying in wait for the signal from the hunter. Mechanics lay beneath the wings of the machines, ready for any command. "For now, we need to practice with the bottles a bit," Lieutenant Karol Pniak addressed me. We were already at the alarm flight, which included, in addition to us, Corporal Vyepshkovich and some another corporal. As a precaution, we put on our parachutes. The backpack sacks didn't bother us at all in the fun, and Carol started the cannonade first. Bottles shattered, stakes went up. The fog had already disappeared, and the sky was covered with daytime clouds. Silence prevailed around, interrupted only by the dry crackle of pistol shots. The sounds of the ongoing war hadn't reached us yet. It seemed somewhat unreal, lurking somewhere far away. I was just aligning the pistol sight on a bulging flask when the mechanic shouted, "Take off!" I instantly turned around and saw a green flare against the backdrop of towering snow-white cumulus clouds. I threw the pistol to the ground and in one swift motion found myself in the cockpit. I fastened the straps in an instant. The engine roared, and 11 rolled into the open space over the fresh, dew-washed clover. Gaining altitude, I took the direction given by the radio station for the enemy aircraft. I flew just above the shreds of billowy clouds at a height of 1,500 meters on a northeast course. I looked around, searching for the enemy, my first enemy. Behind me, 11s followed one after another. Since the sky was clear all around, I shifted my search downward, carefully observing the space between cumulus clouds. Before reaching the Vistula, Where the cloud cover almost completely disappeared, I suddenly spotted a clearly foreign aircraft silhouette at a low altitude in front of me. I turned on the radio and broadcast a short message. Attention, Henschel 126, heading, Timberport, altitude 50 to 100 meters. At the same time, I pushed the machine into a dive. I'm going to attack. The German reconnaissance plane calmly flies on an unchanged course. The crew, evidently engrossed in reconnaissance, self-assured, doesn't seem to be observing the sky. The distance between us rapidly diminishes. I'm not yet spotted. The calmness of the opponent excites me. I feel a shiver running through my entire body. In a moment, I will open fire. Just a few more seconds. The black crosses become increasingly distinct, growing, glaring into view. The crosshair slides over them, slowly adjusting the lead. Suddenly, the Henschel spits towards me with the chaotic fire from the observer. The pilot begins to descend rapidly. The streaks of bullets envelop the entire plane like an octopus. I grip the stick tighter, keeping the sight on target, and continue to approach the enemy. 250 meters. 200. 150. Closer. The thought pierces my brain. Now! I squeeze the trigger. The machine guns play flawlessly. I'm perfectly on his tail. No correction needed. The long burst stops the observer's fire. The propeller abruptly reduces its RPM. A fraction of a second, and the final, short burst from point-blank range, after which I sharply pull the machine up to avoid collision and the fire of Lieutenant Pizarek and Corporal Mielczynski, who caught up with the German. In a half-turn, I see the pilot trying to land the plane on rough terrain. However, it doesn't seem like the plane is being handled by a skilled hand. The pilot must be injured. The Henschel rolls and hops like a drunkard until finally, having dug into the soft, freshly plowed earth, it flips onto its back. The bright blue belly flashes, contrasting sharply with the black, mournful crosses. The 11s performed a dance of death, circling briefly over the victim. Still under the influence of the fought battle, without hesitation, I made a turn and descended for landing. I didn't think at all about the risks of landing in such difficult terrain. But luck comes in pairs. After a moment, 11, shaking on the unevenness, completed the run in the nearby vicinity of the wrecked Henschel. There was emptiness all around. All the other fighters had already flown away. Only the engine of my 11 could be heard, running at low RPM. I quickly jumped out of the machine and ran towards the wreck. However, a sudden thought halted my rush, and with the same speed I turned back to turn off the engine. The prospect of a German pilot escaping on my machine seemed almost like a fantasy in these conditions, but I preferred to rule out such a possibility. For someone unfamiliar with the equipment of my plane, starting the engine would pose a serious obstacle to playing a nasty prank on me. I tucked the starter handle under the seat and only then returned to the Henschel. I expected to find the crew inside the plane, injured or dead. However, the seats were empty and both cabins were full of blood. I immediately began searching for Germans. On the extension of the forced landing path, about 15 meters away, on the opposite side of a narrow stream, I saw the white expanse of an unfolded parachute, and beside it, a lying figure. I jumped over the stream and found myself facing the first war victim I had seen. The German lay on his back, covered in blood, unconscious. His open mouth, covered in foam and blood, emitted a wheezing sound. Apparently, upon impact with the ground, the aviator was ejected from the plane, and the parachute, hooked onto something, unfolded automatically. However, there was no sign of the second crew member anywhere. Several people, drawn by the sight of the battle and the German crash, were running from different directions, cutting across fields to reach the site. For a moment, I still scanned the surroundings carefully, searching the nearby bushes and groves, but nothing indicated the presence of the second German. I decided, therefore, to temporarily assist the severely wounded. I had just managed to fold the parachute and arrange it as a makeshift bed for the German when the first curious individuals reached us. I instructed them to search the edge of the nearby forest, where the second German might be seeking shelter. All the men scattered in the direction I indicated. A woman remained with me, and she helped me move the wounded man onto the makeshift bed. Then I headed towards the crashed Henschel, where I had noticed a first aid kit earlier. With a swift swing of my hand, I shattered the artificial glass and scooped out its entire contents. Various types of bandages, scissors, syringes, and various medications of which I had no clue about their purpose. Using the scissors, I cut the sleeves of the aviator's uniform and shirt, carefully removing all coverings from the wounded man. The heavy wound to the shot-through shoulder was bleeding profusely. With the help of the woman, I washed the pilot's face with clean water from the stream, poured iodine on the wound, and then applied compresses, bandaging as tightly as possible to stop the bleeding. As we were about to move the wounded man, I raised my head and briefly glanced towards the nearby bushes. I had the impression that something moved there. I focused my gaze on the area, and this time I had no doubt. I distinctly recognized the silhouette of a person in a flight suit, only slightly different in color from the surrounding greenery. I took a few steps forward and shouted the only German word I knew. "Halt!" After that, in Polish, I added, "Hands up!" At the same time, I reached into my pocket for the pistol, but instead of the gun, my hand found a silver cigarette case. Only then did I realize that, in the heat of the alarm, I had thrown the pistol to the ground. A quick decision was needed. I swiftly pulled out the cigarette case and, mimicking it as a weapon, aimed it directly at the German. The German moved, slowly raising his hands, dragging one leg behind him, emerging slowly from the bushes. I then lowered my hand to prevent him from seeing up close that my assault weapon was absolutely useless. Seeing that the pilot could not move, I ran towards him. I took away his Mauser, offered him a cigarette from the presumed pistol, and lit it for him. He smiled through the pain, nodded his head, and taking the cigarette, uttered, "Danke schön." My fears now seemed ridiculous. The wounded German was incapable of any hostile reaction or escape. Placing his arm across my shoulder, I led him to his comrade in misery, laying him next on the soft surface of the parachute. I gave him a pack of Egyptian cigarettes and matches, then returned to Good Samaritan duties. At the moment when I raised the wounded man with my left hand, supporting myself with my right on the ground to allow the woman to pull the bandage, the German, who had been observing our actions closely all this time, leaned in and unexpectedly kissed my hand. I recoiled as if burned. For a brief moment our eyes met. My eyes seemed to express nothing but surprise, while in his I discerned clear gratitude. I reciprocated with a smile. I knew that my human duty compelled me to complete what I was doing to the end. The one responsible for the tragedy was someone else, the one who pitted us against each other. "I will finish here myself, and you can take care of the other one in the meantime, ma'am," I said to the woman, who grabbed scissors and leaned over the second patient. However, he began speaking rapidly in an unintelligible language. From his gestures, I deduced that it was a protest. "What happened?" I asked in Polish, looking in his direction. "I don't know," she replied, puzzled. "He doesn't want me to touch him." "Nein, Flieger," the German exclaimed, pointing at me with his hand. I smiled knowingly. The woman shrugged her shoulders, and I helped her arrange and cover the unconscious first German. In the meantime, people who had previously gone in search of the missing aviator were returning, gathering around us. The crowd became dense, and murmurs of disapproval began to rise against the Germans. "It's better to hang them from that branch by their legs and dip their heads in water rather than treating them," comments reached my ears. "Damn them, they wounded my horse," said someone. "Because of them, I have to leave home tomorrow. I got my draft card." The atmosphere turned unpleasant. Among the onlookers, I noticed a railway worker in a uniform. "Signalman?" I asked. he grunted reluctantly when addressed. Please run to your signal box immediately and call the district hospital in Toring. Tell them that on the officer's orders, they should send an ambulance immediately for the wounded. Tell them what happened here, too. The 2 gunshot wounds of the second German were not severe. Bones were intact, and the bleeding was weak. Soon, I finished applying the bandages. A figure in dark clothing appeared nearby. From the collar insignia, I recognized him as a clergyman. He silently observed the wounded aviators for a moment, then turned to me. Sir, do you mind if I provide them with spiritual comfort, especially to the severely wounded? I am German and a pastor in this area. I gave my consent. The pastor then addressed the healthier and conscious prisoner in German. He explained something for a long time, which I did not understand. The aviator waved his hand, replied briefly and sharply, then turned his back. The pastor looked at me with bitterness, apologized, and wanted to leave. That's when I asked what the wounded man had told him. He didn't want any comfort or even a kind word from me. He insulted me, accusing me of approaching him with such intentions. I stared into the pastor's eyes, an old man. He lowered his eyes to the ground. Apparently, he felt embarrassed in front of me. We remained silent. He grabbed my hand, shook it several times. It's hard to watch what's happening, he whispered with pain. As a pastor and a German, I thank you, sir, for what you've done for them. May God keep you in his care. He bowed and walked away with heavy steps. I started searching the pockets of my captives. In fact, this is what I should have begun with, but I thought that the first duty was to provide aid to the wounded. I discreetly unbuttoned the seagull badges and the pilot badge from the collar. I absolved myself of this innocent plundering. In the prisoner's pockets, I found letters and photographs of 2 blondes with candy-like beauty, the pilot's and the observer's IDs. Both were my age. One came from Darmstadt, the other from Königsberg. The conscious prisoner had been closely observing my actions the whole time. When I bundled up all this property, worthless from a military point of view, he spoke to me in incomprehensible words, pointing to the contents of my hand. I only understood the word Fräulein, and the pleading expression on his face helped me understand the request. I returned his ID, letters, and photographs. I'll keep the pilot's badge and seagull as a memento, I said in Polish. The delighted German mumbled something, of which I understood only Danke schön. We even initiated a cigarette exchange on my initiative. I took a pack of his Niels while giving him an unopened pack of Egyptians in return. It was evident that he was pleased with the transaction. I jumped across the stream, and with a sizable crowd around me, headed towards the wreckage of the downed plane. I persuaded a farmer, whose horse had been shot, that it was likely one of our plane's bullets, as the Germans were only shooting upwards. I also tried to convince the gathered locals that their idea of hanging unarmed prisoners was inhumane. I argued that these men were no longer a threat, and our focus should be on those who were coming after them, strong and heavily armed. The villagers began to explain. You're right, Lieutenant. We just set out of spite. We saw those scoundrels flying towards Torung since dawn. Anger gets to a person, but if push came to shove, surely no one would harm them. It must have been a while when I spotted an ambulance approaching through the fields. The arriving sergeant took the wounded on board, reported to me, and then left with them. I began searching through cockpit and observer's cabin of the crashed Henschel. I found forage caps, gas masks, 2 Leica cameras, and most importantly, 2 maps in different scales indicating the reconnaissance area. The maps also detailed likely directions of the planned German attacks. So the reconnaissance plane turned out to be a valuable capture. Carefully, I washed the blood off the maps and dried them. I took the loot to my 11. I decided to fly directly to Toring Airfield to deliver the maps as quickly as possible to the Army headquarters. I worried, however, whether I would even land on that airfield, knowing it had been thoroughly bombed. As the crowd of onlookers lingered after the departure of the wounded, expecting further events, I asked for help with the takeoff. The people gladly joined me in heading to the plane. When I looked at the field in the takeoff direction, I felt the tension. I cursed myself silently for letting nerves take over, landing in those rough fields. The takeoff field was too short, and to make matters worse, there were some birch trees growing there, and the freshly plowed soil was soft. There was nothing better nearby, and it was impossible even to dream of relocating the plane to a more suitable runway. I decided to give it a try. I climbed into the cockpit, started the engine, and added throttle to turn the plane 180 degrees towards the takeoff. Nothing happened. I pulled the throttle more towards me. Something in the tail started to move slightly. I increased the RPM even more, but still there was no visible effect. The machine stood as if anchored. Anger overwhelmed me. I eased off the throttle, unfastened the seatbelts, and jumped out of the plane. The wheels were completely stuck in the soft ground, and there was no way I could turn them. With the help of people, I cleared of the soil around the landing gear with a shovel, then showed them how to lift the tail and turn the plane in the opposite direction. Once again, I took my place in the cockpit. The plane was finally set in the takeoff direction. I instructed to put one wheel in the furrow plowed by a skid, providing a somewhat harder surface. I looked again at the field and the obstacle in the form of a young birch grove. I looked with fear. I gently pressed the brakes and slightly added throttle. As the tail began to shake and lift, I released the brakes, simultaneously moving the throttle steadily. The released machine, swaying over the uneven, soft terrain with a slight tilt to the right, and started rolling, gradually gaining speed. The trees were rapidly approaching. I didn't feel enough speed on the stick to lift the plane yet. I moved it slightly towards me, quickly assessed the distance, and with no choice, against common sense, decided to try to lift off. Trembling, it grazed the skids a few more times. I was in the air. At minimal speed, I pulled up with tension, fearing a collision with the trees. The crowns flickered, and I heard an unpleasant grinding of branches against the landing gear and fuselage. The plane was gently embraced by the trees, trying to pull it back to the ground. After 15 minutes, I circled over the heavily bombed touring airfield, looking for a suitable spot to land. Eventually, I landed on a heath adjacent to the airfield, using a field road in the final run. Joy spread among my colleagues as I tossed them a German cap and other trophies from the downed plane. An airfield defense flight under the command of Lieutenant John Chapievsky was stationed there. When I got off the plane, Chapievsky stood with his head bandaged. He explained that during the bombing, he got hit near the ear by shrapnel. "Imagine this. They almost got me in the middle of the airfield as I was going back to the planes," he recounted. "It was a close call. I didn't know what to do. I hugged the Mother Earth, and they dropped bombs left and right. Pure hell." He added a rather vulgar curse directed at the certain German mustached man. During this bombing, several people were killed and wounded. The barracks, where it was most crowded, suffered greatly. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a staff car that took me to the headquarters of the Pomoshe Army. I submitted a brief report to Colonel Stahony, the commander of the aviation forces operating within it, and handed over the maps along with the cameras. The information from the maps turned out to be very valuable and immediately went to the operational department. After listening to Colonel Stahony's sarcastic comment about my good hunter-Samaritan exploits, having taken off and receiving envelopes with orders for Captain Laskovsky, I returned to the field airport while leading the defense flight to our runway. Unfortunately, due to darkness and fog, we couldn't land and had to return to Torung. I spent the night in the fort adjacent to the southern edge of the airfield. As I lay in the iron yet comfortable bed, relief came. I relived the events of the whole day. Then, thoughts extended to broader matters. Fighting, I somewhat forgot that a war was going on. Direct experiences and the tension of battle focused attention so much that the ability to think about anything else was lost. All the how, whether, and when that came to my mind that evening had to remain unanswered for now. I felt the unbearable weight of uncertainty. The next day, without any obstacles or issues, I landed at our field airport. Captain Laskovsky already knew about my exploits from Colonel Stahoni. He strictly forbade me from repeating anything similar in the future. "And your prisoners," he added, "are full of praise for the care you've provided. They insisted on knowing your name. They were so persistent that their curiosity had to be satisfied, which I think won't harm you if you ever met a similar fate." I felt uneasy. Laskovsky's idea wasn't that unrealistic after all. The war had only just begun.